the unseen presence. About 25 years ago, my now ex-wife and I were caretaking a house out in the country. It was an old, sprawling farmhouse, far enough from the nearest neighbors that the only company we had was the occasional creak of the floorboards and the hum of the wind outside. We'd been staying there for several weeks, and though everything seemed outwardly normal, there was one thing we couldn't shake: a bone-deep feeling that something was wrong. It always started in the cellar. Every time we had to go down there for something, whether it was to grab a jar of jam or a bottle of wine, we'd both feel it, a thick, palpable tension in the air. It was as though something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for us to turn our backs. But what really unnerved us was the staircase that led up from the cellar. It felt like something would grab you as soon as you turned off the light and started climbing the stairs. It was as if invisible hands were closing in from every direction, just waiting for you to turn around. Neither of us ever dared to linger at the top of the stairs after turning off the light. But beyond that, the house seemed like any other, at least during the day. It was just us, a dusty old house, and the weird feeling that seemed to follow us, especially from the cellar. We slept with an old analog wind-up alarm clock next to our bed, the kind with the two bells on top that ring loudly when it goes off. It had that unmistakable tick-tick-tick sound, the kind that only an old mechanical clock can make. You set it by adjusting a little hand on the dial, a physical process that seems so foolproof. We set the alarm for 6 a.m. every night, never really fiddled with it. It was simple, old school, and reliable. One night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, we were jolted awake by the shrill ringing of the alarm. It was as though the bells were being struck by something furious, each clang louder and more erratic than usual. The noise cut through the stillness of the house, making my heart race. Both of us shot upright in bed, our senses reeling. I was terrified. There was no reason for the alarm to be going off. I glanced over at the clock. The little hand, which was normally set to 6 a.m., had moved. It had somehow been shifted to 2 a.m. At that moment, something else happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a small figure dart across the room. It was quick, barely a blur, and too small to be human, no bigger than 2 feet tall. My heart skipped a beat. I thought I had imagined it. Maybe the dark had gotten to my head, or maybe I'd been dreaming. But then my ex-wife screamed, and her voice shattered the silence. "Did you see that thing?" We both froze, our bodies still locked in that fight-or-flight panic, and we described the figure in eerie detail. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. No, this thing had shape. It was small, hunched, almost like a twisted little gremlin with long, spindly arms and a grotesque, snarling face. It darted across the room, vanishing before we could process what had just happened. We could feel its presence even after it was gone, a suffocating, sinister energy that clung to the air. But it was the clock that sent us into pure terror. The alarm hand hadn't just been moved, it was as if it had been deliberately reset to 2 a.m. It was a mechanical clock. There was no way it could have shifted on its own, not without someone, or something, manipulating it. We both stared at the clock, completely dumbfounded. We were in shock. It was as if the house itself had decided to show us something dark, something far older than we could comprehend. After that night, things didn't feel quite right. The unsettling feeling that had always lingered in the cellar grew more oppressive, creeping into every corner of the house. We couldn't explain what had happened that night, but it was clear to both of us that something was watching us. It wasn't a mere feeling anymore, it was a presence. And no matter how hard we tried to shake it, we both felt it, especially as the nights grew longer. But after that one incident, nothing else ever happened. No more figures. No more strange occurrences. Yet we both knew deep down that whatever had moved the clock and shown itself to us had not gone away. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Even now, I can't forget that feeling, the sensation of something waiting just out of sight, its cold breath on the back of my neck. That damn cellar, the feeling never left. And to this day, I don't sleep easy at night. Every time I hear an old clock tick, I remember that night. That thing. And the way the air in that house felt like it was constantly holding its breath, just waiting for us to make a mistake. The shadow on the top floor. I had worked in the nursing home for years, mostly on the night shifts. Over the course of those years, I'd heard every kind of complaint from the staff and residents about strange noises and eerie happenings on the top floor. People said they heard footsteps echoing down empty halls, whispers in the dark, and even things being moved around when no one was there. I never believed any of it. I was always the one they sent up there to check the rooms, do the rounds, and make sure everything was in order. I figured it was just the creaks of an old building or the wind playing tricks. One night, things changed and my skepticism was shattered. To start it off like any other shift, I was on the top floor with a colleague, changing a resident who was bedridden. As we worked, my colleague muttered that he kept hearing footsteps outside the room. "It's probably just the pipes," I said, not looking up. But my colleague didn't seem convinced. "No, it's definitely footsteps, like someone walking up here with us," he insisted. I brushed it off though, like I always did. But as soon as I walked out of the resident's room to grab fresh bed sheets from the cupboard at the end of the long corridor, something felt off. The hallway was unnervingly quiet as always, but then I started hearing it, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing in the distance, followed by a rustling sound. It was as if someone was walking slowly, deliberately down the hall, followed by the crinkle of plastic bags. The sound was coming from farther down the corridor, and the closer I got to the cupboard, the more distinct the noise became, like someone was standing there, methodically opening and closing plastic bags. It irritated me at first. We had a lot of work to do, and I didn't have time to entertain some overactive imagination. I thought maybe it was one of the other staff members, but as I reached the cupboard, there was no one there. Just the silence. No footsteps. No rustling. I grabbed the bedsheets and started heading back. That's when it happened. I heard the footsteps again, and they were closer this time, too close. Like someone was right behind me. The rustling sound of plastic bags followed, the noise of something, or someone, moving in the dark. I couldn't explain it. My heart started racing, and my skin prickled with an undeniable sense of dread. Annoyed, I glanced back into the hallway, half expecting to see one of my colleagues standing there, messing around. But what I saw instead froze me in place. A shadow. It was massive. The shadow stretched across the hallway, long and distorted, like a person had just passed by, but the scale of it was all wrong. The shadow didn't match the size of the doorways or the walls. It was as if something much larger than a normal person had just walked past, casting an enormous shape that swallowed the dim light from the hallway. The shadow moved fluidly, but with an unnatural heaviness, as if it belonged in the dark, something that shouldn't be in the light of day. I heard the footsteps again, now right outside the door to the resident's room where I stood, and that rustling, the plastic bag noise too. The steps sounded deliberate, slow, as though whoever, or whatever, was walking was toying with me. It was like they knew I was there and they were waiting for me to do something. I didn't dare move. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming for me to run, to do something, but I couldn't. I couldn't pull myself away from the door, from the hallway. My entire body was stiff with fear, paralyzed by the sight of that shadow, its edges blurred as if it was shifting and warping the air around it. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the silence of the hall. And then it came again, a soft thud like something heavy being set down, followed by a long dragging noise. That was it. My breath hitched in my throat, and without thinking, I backed into the resident's room, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my colleague's arm, shaking him. "Get up here now," I managed to whisper, my voice barely a rasp. "I'm not going out there alone." I didn't care how crazy I sounded. I didn't care that I had always been the one to dismiss the rumors, the one to make light of everyone else's fears. I had seen something, or at least I thought I had. Something that was not supposed to be there. When my colleague arrived, I bolted out of the room and ran down the stairs, trying to shake off the feeling that something was still following me, its presence lingering like a shadow in the corners of my mind. From that night on, everything changed. I was no longer the one who volunteered for the night shifts on the top floor. I avoided it at all costs. Every time I had to go back up, my heart would race, my palms would sweat, and the sound of those footsteps would echo in my mind. I couldn't stop hearing the rustling of plastic bags, couldn't shake the image of that towering shadow that had crossed the hallway. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I do know this. I stopped believing in coincidence, and I never again went upstairs alone after dark. Not even once. The night shifts on the top floor weren't the same anymore. Every creak, every rustle, every shadow felt like a warning. And I couldn't help but wonder, what had been walking with me that night, and why had it decided to make itself known? The Cold Man in the Tunnel. My uncle worked for years on the London Underground, doing maintenance and checking the tracks deep within the tunnels. It was a tough job, working late into the night, often miles below ground. The tunnels themselves were dark and eerie, filled with the hum of trains that echoed in the distance and the clatter of tools. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened one night. It started like any other maintenance check. He and two colleagues were assigned to inspect a particularly long stretch of track. The deep, humid air of the tunnel always felt oppressive, the dim lights above casting long shadows that seemed to twist and move as they worked. It was one of those nights when everything seemed ordinary, until it wasn't. They were in the middle of some routine maintenance when the strange thing happened. They'd stopped to do something on the track, and while my uncle was bent over working, one of his colleagues suddenly heard someone speak. A man's voice, clear and direct, called out his name. "Hey, Uncle's name, can you show me the way out?" Thinking it was one of his team members, my uncle didn't think twice. "You know the way out," he replied, still focused on the task at hand, not bothering to turn around to see who it was. But then the voice came again, this time with a sense of urgency. "I'm so cold." It was a strange thing to say, especially down here in the tunnels where the air was always chilly, but nothing to make him feel alarmed. Not yet. But then something strange happened, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Suddenly the air around him grew ice cold. So cold that it felt unnatural. His breath clouded in the air like smoke, and the temperature seemed to drop so quickly, so sharply, that it felt like a physical presence pressing in on him. He looked around, his focus now split between his work and the odd chill that had settled around him. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling was suffocating. The others were still working, but my uncle couldn't shake the sudden unease. His curiosity got the better of him, and he finally turned around. That's when he saw him. A man stood there just a few feet away, holding an old vintage lamp. The light from the lamp flickered weakly in the tunnel's gloom, casting long, sickly shadows that seemed to distort the space around them. He was wearing a filthy, old-fashioned uniform, something that didn't belong to any of the modern crews working in the tunnels. The man's clothes were stained and worn, almost as if he'd been working in those tunnels for decades, maybe even longer. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes seemed to have an unnatural depth to them, as though something was terribly wrong. The feeling that washed over my uncle was almost instantaneous. He knew, deep in his gut, that this wasn't a normal person. There was something about him, something off, that screamed ghost. The coldness that had settled around them was now impossible to ignore, and my uncle's heart began to race. The man looked straight at him, his lips trembling as he repeated the same words over and over again, almost pleading. "I'm so cold. I'm so cold." The words were hollow, like an echo from somewhere far away, and the more he said them, the more my uncle's stomach churned with dread. The man's voice wasn't just cold, it was dead. It felt as though the man himself was a part of the cold, as if his very essence was frozen in time. My uncle tried to shake the growing sense of panic that crept up on him. He forced himself to be calm, to think rationally. "Can you see a light anywhere?" he asked the man, his voice unsteady. Maybe you need to follow the light out of here." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked at my uncle with vacant eyes, and then, with a soft, almost inaudible whisper, he said, "Can you help me? I'm so cold." It was then that one of my uncle's colleagues, who had heard the strange conversation, approached the figure. At first, he thought it was some sort of prank. Maybe one of their other colleagues was playing a joke, pretending to be lost in the tunnels to mess with them. But when he stepped closer, the figure didn't move. It didn't seem to react at all. That's when the reality hit. The man disappeared. One second he was standing there, lamp in hand, cold and desperate. The next there was nothing. The air remained cold, but the man was gone, vanished as if he had never been there at all. No footsteps, no rustling of clothes, just empty space where he once stood. My uncle and his colleagues stood in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. They all stared at the spot where the figure had been, their breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. My uncle's heart was pounding in his chest, and the realization of what he had just seen began to settle in. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. The unspoken understanding between them was clear. They had seen something that shouldn't exist. Something that was not a part of this world. None of them went back into that tunnel after that. They couldn't. The fear that gripped them was paralyzing. The sensation of that unnatural cold, the way the man had stared at them with those dark, empty eyes, haunted them. But even more so was the idea that this wasn't the only time the ghost had appeared. Other colleagues had reported seeing the man, always in the same part of the tunnel, always muttering about how cold he was, never able to escape the freezing grip of whatever had claimed him. My uncle retired years later, but even now he can't shake the memory of that night. Sometimes, when he's alone or walking through a quiet room, he can still feel the presence of that man. He'll hear the whisper of those words in his mind, I'm so cold. And every time the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, as if the coldness is creeping back into his bones, as if the man is standing just behind him, holding that flickering lamp, begging for help that will never come. The tunnels beneath London are old, and the ghosts that haunt them have stories of their own. Stories that will never be told, except to those unfortunate enough to meet them. The shadow in the room. For as long as I could remember, I'd seen what people often called shadow people. It started in childhood, and wherever I lived they seemed to follow, dark, fleeting figures that moved just out of the corner of my eye, never fully solid but always there, always watching. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing games. The world is full of odd sensations after all, and I always preferred to believe that there was a reasonable explanation for it all. But the truth was, every time I saw one of those shadows, a cold, uncomfortable feeling crawled up my spine, and deep down, I knew there was something off about it. One afternoon, I was sitting on my bed with one of my kids and our cat, playing a simple board game. The room was peaceful, quiet. The sun was setting outside, casting soft light through the window, the kind of late afternoon glow that made everything feel calm and safe. It was a normal day, or at least I thought it was. That I saw it. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of my vision. But then it grew clearer, more distinct, and before I could dismiss it, the shadow came into full view. The form was tall, impossibly dark, its outline as sharp as it was formless. It moved swiftly from the doorway, the figure's long, angular silhouette slipping from the entrance to the bathroom wall that connected the bedroom. There was no sound, no rustle of clothes or footsteps, just the presence of something moving as if it belonged there, passing through the room without a care. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I had seen shadow people before, but this was different. This wasn't some faint flicker or a corner of their eye trick. This was as real as the walls around me. What made it even worse was that I wasn't the only one who had seen it. My cat, who had been lounging calmly at the edge of the bed, suddenly perked up. Her ears swiveled toward the doorway, her pupils dilated, her body tensing. She was staring intently, her eyes fixed on the very spot where the shadow had disappeared into the bathroom. Her gaze followed the figure's path, her fur bristling slightly as she remained perfectly still. For the first time, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief wash over me. Fear because I realized that what I had seen wasn't just in my head. The cat had seen it too. But relief because I wasn't crazy. It wasn't just me imagining things. Something or someone was in the room with us. I wasn't alone in this. Before I could process what was happening, my son looked up at me from the board game. His face had changed, a strange expression in his eyes. His voice was low, almost casual, but there was something behind it that sent a chill straight to my bones. "Did you see him too?" he asked, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. My mind raced. Could it be possible? "The man," my son said, his eyes wide now, but not with fear. More with understanding. The man that was standing there, in the doorway. A cold lump formed in my throat. I stared at him, the pieces falling into place. "You've seen him before?" I asked, hardly able to believe the words. My son nodded, slowly, his gaze fixed on the spot where the shadow had disappeared. "Yeah, for years. I thought you'd think it was just my imagination, so I didn't say anything." A rush of emotions flooded through me, disbelief, confusion, and a gnawing fear. This wasn't just a one-time occurrence. My son had been seeing the same shadowy figures for years, and like me, he had kept it to himself. He hadn't said anything because he was scared I'd brush it off as some childish fantasy. But we were wrong. We weren't imagining it. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house changed. The shadows, once easily explained away, seemed to linger longer, darker. There was an intensity to them now. I'd catch glimpses of them in the corners of my vision more frequently, always moving, always watching. The house itself seemed quieter, heavier. It was as if something was drawing closer, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. One night, while we were getting ready for bed, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. The air felt thicker, colder, and the shadows in the room shifted strangely. That familiar, unsettling presence was back, but this time it felt different, stronger, more aggressive. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up as I looked around the room, almost expecting to see one of the figures right in front of me. But there was nothing. Suddenly, the cat let out a low growl from the hallway, her eyes wide and fixed on something beyond the door. My son, too, stiffened, his expression turning from calm to anxious as he stared into the dark hallway. I grabbed his hand, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze was locked on something in the darkness that I couldn't see. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, so low that it could have been the wind or a trick of the house settling. But it wasn't. It was words. Barely audible, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "I'm so cold." My son shivered beside me. "It's him again," he whispered. The shadows were closing in now, creeping along the walls, curling into the corners of the room. The air grew even colder, impossibly so, and the whisper grew louder, closer, until it was right behind us, just over our shoulders. "I'm so cold." I spun around, but there was nothing. The room was empty. The shadows, however, felt more solid now, more real. They weren't just shapes in the corners anymore. They were present. They were alive. I realized then that these weren't just figments of our imagination. This wasn't something that could be explained away. Whatever was here, whatever was watching us, was far older and darker than we could comprehend. And it wasn't going anywhere. The Shadow Man, or whatever he was, wasn't just passing through. He had a purpose, and it wasn't over yet. The haunted basement. I've had a few unnerving experiences in my life, but none quite as strange as what happened to me in the funeral home basement. There were two main encounters that stuck with me, and each one brought me closer to believing that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this world than we can explain. The first experience, though unsettling, was almost calm compared to the second. It happened when I was alone in the building, a funeral home eerily silent after everyone had left. I was walking through the halls when I heard a soft voice, barely a whisper, call out, "Hello." The voice wasn't loud or demanding, but more like someone who was unsure of where they were or what was happening. At first, I thought it was one of the staff or maybe someone from the service still lingering, but there was no one around. I followed the sound of the voice, which seemed to come from a room not far down the hall. When I entered, the room was perfectly still, not a single sound. Not even the creak of the floorboards, which was strange because the floors always had this distinct, old groaning noise when anyone walked across them. It was a sound you could count on, like a quiet warning of someone's presence. But here there was nothing. I looked around, heart racing slightly. Everything was completely silent, the only movement coming from the faintest swaying of curtains in a breeze I couldn't feel. And then, my eyes settled on a body lying in a casket, prepared for viewing after the church service. The strange voice, the absence of sound, the quiet that swallowed everything, it all seemed to be tied to that room. There was a presence in the room, something I couldn't explain. It was as if the atmosphere itself was confused, not angry, not malevolent, just lost. It didn't feel threatening. Instead, it felt like I was intruding on a space that didn't quite belong to the living anymore. After a moment, that sensation faded, and I was left with a cold, uneasy curiosity. That experience left me wondering about things I had always written off, but it was the second incident that would change my perspective forever. One day, I was in the basement with a few friends, passing the time by playing airsoft in the common area. We were teenagers, full of bravado, and the dimly lit basement of the funeral home was an unusual but perfect spot to hide out. The basement was always colder than the rest of the building, and the lighting was uneven. Some corners were dark, no matter how many lights you turned on. One particular corner always had a strange quality to it. It was darker, even when the light should have reached it. It felt wrong, like there was something pulling the light away, a heavy presence hanging in the air. I remember standing there, behind an old set of shelves, staring into that shadowy corner. I'd always been skeptical of ghost stories, even after my first encounter, but something about this place made me uneasy. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, and went back to the game. Suddenly the air shifted. The sounds around me, the laughter, the footsteps, the distant shuffling of my friends, all faded away into a heavy silence. It was as though the entire basement had been muffled by some invisible force. A cold breath tickled the back of my neck. At first I thought it was just a draft, but then I realized the air around me was still. There were no vents in the basement, no open windows. And yet, the coldness seeped into my skin, chilling me to the bone. Before I could react, I heard it, shallow breathing right behind me. The sound was wet, almost like the sound of someone struggling for breath. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a wave of goosebumps crawling across my skin. I slowly turned around, expecting to see one of my friends standing there playing a prank. But no one was there. The air was thick with the sound of my own heartbeat, and I felt my pulse quicken as I scanned the space behind me. Nothing. The corner was still dark, but there was no movement, no person standing there, just the oppressive feeling of being watched. I didn't waste any more time. I bolted out of that corner and ran to find my friends. I could still hear the breathing in my ears, following me even though I was alone. When I finally found them in the next room, they looked confused. They told me I had been gone for at least half an hour, which was impossible. I'd only stepped away for a minute. But I hadn't been in that dark corner for half an hour. Time had seemed to stretch and warp in that basement, as if the space itself had been altered, or maybe I had been pulled into something else entirely. After that day, everything changed. Every time I did laundry downstairs, I could feel it. The oppressive silence, the unnatural chill. And when I finished, I'd hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and echoing up the stairs behind me. It wasn't the sound of someone walking up behind me, though. It was more like the footsteps were moving alongside me, but I could never see anyone there. It wasn't just my imagination. It never was. I started rushing through the laundry, trying to get out of that basement as quickly as possible. But no matter how fast I moved, those footsteps always seemed to follow, always just behind me, as though something was walking in my shadow, its presence growing stronger every time. I never told anyone about the footsteps, about the cold breath, about the way time had seemed to slip away in that dark corner. But I could never shake the feeling that the funeral home basement, or whatever it was beneath the floorboards, had a presence that didn't belong in this world. And it was waiting for me, waiting for all of us.